And we join Jesus as he enters the temple in Jerusalem. And we read some rather interesting words. He's overturning tables, he's driving people out of the temple. Normally, Jerusalem had around 20,000 people here during this feast of Passover. Many Jews have made their pilgrim journey to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, and the city is swelling with probably around 100,000 people. And the temple's become this big kind of money-making commerce machine. And really, when you think of temples, many religions have temples, and there's really two things that take place there. Primarily, they expect to meet and encounter God there, and secondly, they offer sacrifices there. And we see in the Old Testament, of course, the first temple meeting place of God with humanity was the Garden of Eden, and after that we see excuse me, God revealing himself to Abraham and then dwelling with his people in the tabernacle with Moses through their wilderness wanderings. And then Solomon builds the temple for God to dwell. And during the time of Jeremiah, the prophet rebukes God's people for thinking they can do whatever they want and saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They would flee to the temple for refuge or claim the temple was their way of being blessed or cleansed. And Jeremiah rebukes them because it's not the temple that blesses or cleanses, it's God who does. And so as Jesus enters the temple, he sees how the temple is now profaned. People are wanting to enter in and to be somewhat faithful and offer sacrifices to God, and they're being taken advantage of financially. There's all sorts of swindling going on, and zeal for his Father's house consumes him, is what the Bible writers say. Now, what we have in Jesus, of course, is the true temple of God, the dwelling of God with humanity, actually as a human, the eternal Son of God. We read in John's Gospel that the Word, becomes flesh and tabernacles among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father. And Jesus is the true temple of God, the true dwelling place of God. Even in Matthew's gospel, he's Emmanuel, God with us. And Jesus, Matthew says in Matthew 1:21, you will call his name Jesus, he will save his people from their sins. So Jesus isn't merely the temple and the dwelling place of God, but he is, of course, a sacrifice of God. And a sacrifice that he's giving is one of faithful obedience to God, cleansing the temple from being profaned here. And of course, he will offer himself not in the temple, but on a cross. And that's just a few days later this week. And so we're going to journey together and see all the events that lead up to that place. But just keep in mind that Jesus is both the dwelling place of God with humanity as one of us in the flesh, and the sacrifice of humanity to God. He lives a life of a sacrificial obedience and love to God and neighbor. In every way, ways that we don't. And then he bears the punishment for the sins of all who believe upon the cross. He sheds his blood. All the sacrifices pointed to that. And the temple pointed to God's presence among his people. And Jesus is, of course, the true presence and true sacrifice on the scene in Jerusalem, kicking up quite a bit of dust. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow as we continue in our series on Holy Week. Be blessed.